Welcome to episode 70 of Rebirth Revolution. My name is Melissa Olson. Last week, I thought I'd take a little break after writing, recording, editing, and posting the podcast episode before moving on to my next task. I sat down to check in on the news, and the attack on the Capitol had begun. I barely moved for hours. We've seen a lot of crazy, dark stuff in the last 4 years, but this was shocking. Somehow shocking, yet not surprising. It had all been leading here. All of it animated and incited by a big lie. The lie was that Biden did not actually win the election, that his win was fraudulent. Everyone was pumped up from being told that the election was stolen from them. In fact, the big lie was started long before the election. They were told that any outcome other than their leader winning would have to be illegitimate. It doesn't occur to those who still believe this that if there were evidence, actual evidence instead of broad assertions, that the courts could act to remedy the situation. But what a lawyer or others can say on TV or on the internet is not what they can say in a court of law. There are consequences for lawyers if they lie in court. So they had no evidence that would support this allegation. But they kept telling it outside of the court, and they assembled a group of politicians who would continue to tell the lie. And they had news sources that broadcasted the lie. And they all did it for the man at the top, the outgoing president. They seemingly do not understand that a cult leader will always leave you either dead or disillusioned. It may seem like this story is about other people, because if you are listening to this podcast, I doubt you would be someone who would have participated in this insurrection. But the thing to keep in mind is that all of the lessons we are here to learn are offered up both in the macro version and in the micro version. What happens in the public sphere holds wisdom that we can employ in the private sphere. I feel compassion for those who have been blinded by the lie, because it is clear in hearing their stories that they are desperate to be part of something big and important. They hitched their wagon to a man with an exceedingly low level of spiritual awareness. He turned on them like he has everyone else. They failed to see this pattern, and they themselves repeated the pattern with great fervor. It's fascinating to see how quickly they turn on one another. Everything is transactional. No one who has supported this mess for more than 4 years is safe from their ire. Few have compromised themselves more than the vice president, and in one word, they were ready to hang him. No one has built up any goodwill. There are no attempts to understand anything. Relationships built on lies are not relationships at all. They are all destined to dissolve in the light of truth. They have been so separated from reality that they are genuinely surprised that there are going to be consequences for their actions, their participation in an attempted coup that ended with people dead and the Capitol desecrated. The thing with humans is that everyone thinks that they are the good guy. These people had been convinced that they were saving the country. In fact, they still believe that. It's all been some sort of fever dream for these people. They have been manipulated and used in the worst ways. The come down will be brutal. The consequences for many will be life-altering. This flashpoint has brought about a chaotic shifting of allegiances. This is to be expected. In the rebirth, everyone has to come out from behind the labels they have slapped on themselves to form their identities. In this transition to a better world, we must all dig deep to figure out what we really believe, what matters to us, and what we are willing to accept. I wonder exactly what was going through the heads of those who earlier in the day would have described themselves as being firmly in the Blue Lives Matter camp, as they beat officers with fire extinguishers and, most sickeningly, with the American flag. Turns out no one is who they thought they were. When you read stories of what radicalized people, you can see a pattern where their lives were a mess. The very government that chose to not deal with the pandemic, which brought about the financial meltdown, created the desperate conditions that they then used to make people feel victimized. Fear and desperation make people susceptible to dark and dangerous thoughts, which can then be manipulated by the very people who were the architects of their misery. This was never meant to be a political podcast, but it is all part of the greater whole. You cannot separate politics from a spiritual awakening, which is what this podcast is ultimately about. It is impossible to miss the fact that the politicians we elect have the ability to either make our lives better or make them worse. Their willingness and ability to deal with the bigger issues that affect us will have a huge impact on our daily lives. So much of what is happening right now is the result of politics. Somehow a public health issue, a pandemic that has now killed over 380,000 people in our country, has become politicized in a way that wearing a mask is a sign that you are on one side politically, and not wearing one is a proud badge of being on the other side. This is utter insanity. It's a pandemic. Viruses don't care what your political beliefs are. There are so many desperate people who are feeling so damaged and intent on damaging others. They have been lied to about what brought this about and what will relieve it. I watched an old movie the other night, one that was set in post-Civil War Missouri, where neighboring farmers were trying to figure out a way forward when some of them had fought for the South and others had fought for the North. Missouri was a state that was divided. The southern part of the state sided with the Confederacy, and the northern part were Union sympathizers. They even had two governments. After the war, they had to somehow come back together. They were all facing mutual destruction because they were now unable to rely on each other's labor to bring the crops in. There was a moment when one farmer, who was asked to consider reuniting with his neighbor who had supported a side different than his own, he listed all that he had lost in the war. Then he said something that made all sorts of sense in our current climate. He said, "All I've got left is my hate, and you're trying to take that away from me too." I'm sure there are many in our country who feel that all they have left is their hate too. The movie, in case you're interested, was The Romance of Rosie Ridge. The general vibe in our country is that we shouldn't discuss politics or that we shouldn't draw conclusions about people based on their political or cult leanings. But look at where this has gone. Living in a polite society has led to the rise in authoritarianism, It has led to people thinking that to kill people of the other party and take over the government is an option. We have talked many times about how in all things there must be opposition. This is one of the important rules of the system. Opposition does put people on the defensive, but that is not a bad thing. Any idea or plan that is met with opposition will ultimately become a better idea or plan. There will always be things that have been overlooked, consequences that have not been anticipated. We need to point that out to each other. The problem is believing that we should never face opposition. This is disastrous in public life as well as in private life. We all need to trust that we can take in additional information, sort through it, and snatch out of it the gems that will help us grow faster and do better for ourselves and others. There is no one walking the earth who has it all figured out, so we need to rely on each other to point out what we have missed. Of course, if the information is based in low-level thinking, we don't need to adopt or adapt to that. That is an opportunity to point out what the person at the low level is missing. That way, we can facilitate their growth with information that they have not yet embraced. If we can implement changes going forward that alleviate the misery of those who are currently lost, they may be less and less ruled by the darkness. Hope and optimism have powerful effects on everyone's ability to move to higher levels. When some people look at the hatred, destruction, and carnage, they say, "This is not who we are." We see that with people who have been called on their individual choices, and we see that response when looking at the culture at large. But this most definitely is who we are right now. What we need to be saying is, this is not who we aspire to be. That is much closer to the truth. As our government inches toward some sort of accountability for the attack, corporations are moving quickly to disassociate themselves from those who perpetuated the big lie that led to the insurrection. Those who supported the insurrection are shocked and feel victimized by this. They do not fundamentally feel that their actions should have consequences. But that's not how life works. Corporate repercussions have power because the choices that led to this mess were made by people who are still in the low levels of spiritual awareness. They are not people who are driven by integrity, honesty, empathy, or humility. They do not care what their choices result in for other people. They do not see the error of their ways. They are still not willing to accept the truth. They have no ability to accept responsibility for their mistakes and figure out a way to course correct. They are incapable of feeling shame. This is true for everyone who is still inhabiting the low levels of spiritual awareness. The only way to get their attention is to endanger their money, their power, and their status. Those are the only currencies they embrace. It is also important that we use these moments to solidify where we are as a collective culture. We need to draw a line in the sand and declare that this will not be permitted. This will not be tolerated. This will not be ignored. As we watch the karma of those who have chosen darkness unfold, we must see how a series of small choices they made led them down their path to destruction. Every tiny concession that a person makes that drags their soul backwards will lead to another seemingly small choice that will continue the backslide. It is never a situation where a person who is at the higher levels of spiritual awareness decides in one moment that they are willing to become a murderous thug bent on destroying our democracy. They have made thousands of small choices to deny the truth, to harbor grievances, to align with darker forces along their downward spiral. But they shoved those choices to the back of their minds. Then one day, they are denied admittance to a flight at the airport because they are designated as a potential terrorist. Oh, the shock and indignation of it all. They cannot calculate how they got where they are, or how it is that people see them in that light. The people who worked for and assisted the outgoing tyrant have compromised their own souls and will now face the consequences of that, and the tyrant could not care less. If you can watch this unfold and remind yourself that you can never sell yourself out for anyone, then you are getting one of the many big lessons this historic event is dishing out. Beware of anyone who brings out the worst parts of you. It can feel exhilarating to tap into your less than noble parts, but there will be repercussions. There are always natural consequences to the choices we make. It is important to point out that a person who is inhabiting the higher levels of spiritual awareness would never ask anyone to sell their soul. That would be unthinkable, because the other person's soul would be as important to them as their own. The most fervent followers have broken from friends and family over lack of allegiance to the president and/or QAnon. That means they will have nothing when this ends, nothing but their hate, and we are trying to take that away from them. Those who have sided with darkness are now prodding the rest of us to just move on. Just get over it. That is the language of every abuser. Again, I'm sure there are personal parallels that you can draw to this type of thinking in your own life. They have no desire to rehash what has happened. They are not willing to accept any responsibility. They want to remain in the same space they currently inhabit, and they want to unify by you moving closer to their position. They want you to forego your own honesty, your own integrity, to give them a pass. There is no way forward without accountability. There can be no unity and healing without truth. Those who have done wrong and are still in the low levels of spiritual awareness want to gloss over this, deflect from this, never actually accepting accountability or fixing anything. Then they accuse you of being mean if you don't also pick up a broom and help sweep it under the rug. When you let them know you are unwilling to do that, they accuse you of having a character flaw. You are unwilling to forgive, unwilling to offer up grace. They will try to convince you that your choice is the greater sin. People at the low levels of spiritual awareness are observant enough to know that those at the higher levels are more capable of compassion and forgiveness. That's why they feel entitled to better treatment than they would ever offer. But we don't help them learn their lessons when we skip the phase where they contemplate their choices and arrive at the natural conclusion that they need to choose better. To skip that delays the enlightenment and means we will need to have another disaster, undoubtedly of greater proportion, caused by their faulty thinking. It is a high-level move to offer grace, but never before the offenders have truly learned the lesson. That is unloving, because it dooms them and all of us to future problems. It makes no sense to forgive anyone who is not sorry. It's an invitation for them to do it again. They will tell you that accountability will just cause more pain, and there is always a threat of more violence should we hold them accountable. It's all a dodge. To a person who is still in the low levels of spiritual awareness, an offer of grace for a choice they have not regretted is nothing but weakness. It is the signal to continue along the dark path. They're asking us to meet them where they are for unity, with no admissions of guilt or an apology. They want to move on even though they still aren't willing to tell the truth. A wound that hasn't been cleaned out will become infected, then attack the entire body. We've already tried that. Historically, the unwillingness to demand accountability has created much of the rot that we are dealing with now. It only delays and increases the problem. We need to have enough love and compassion to insist that everyone's lessons play all the way out. Thanks for listening to Rebirth Revolution. We'll get back to our resolutions when things calm down a bit. Please tell others about Rebirth Revolution. We welcome all. Until next week, listen to the science nerds. Listen to the history nerds. Strengthen your spine and wear your mask. Remember, you are loved exactly as much as every other person on the planet, not 1 ounce more or 1 ounce less. Stay strong and resilient and focused on a better future.